In this episode, we shall be concerned with one of the most important mass movements that Gandhi and the Congress organized in 1920. I am talking about the non-cooperation movement. At one level, it is possible to draw a line between the Rowlatt movement and the non-cooperation movement, because the latter also displayed certain features that Rowlatt Satyagraha had already suggested. There was an element of regional unevenness in the extent of mobilization. Certain regions responded more enthusiastically to the idea of non-cooperation, certain other regions didn't. But even in those regions where there was a measure of popular support for the non-cooperation, there were also dissenting voices. Historians who have their different perspectives about the non-cooperation movement. Some scholars argue that non-cooperation was actually sustained by a pressure from below. Others try to make the point that non-cooperation success or the ultimate collapse of the movement depended on the nature of Congress mobilization. So you have a large number of questions concerning the complexity in the nature of mobilization, concerning the regional variations in the extent of mobilization. But before we actually touch on these complexities and look at the regional variations in the nature of non-cooperation mobilization, it may be useful for us to look at some of the broad historiographical positions. In the first place, the event can be studied in terms of a certain run-up to a climax of certain political forces which had become active from the end of the First World War. And the political context in India after the war, prices were rising, popular disaffections were growing, people had become somewhat alienated from the imperial state because of the Punjab disturbances and all that. The second layer of analysis actually takes us to those complexities which we are actually referring to. There were different kinds of movements which eventually coalesced in the non-cooperation movement. They found an occasion for them to identify more closely with the Congress and the mainstream nationalist leadership, even though the motivations for them to participate in this movement might have varied. Now, when I am looking at the first part of the story, that itself can be segmented. At one level, you see rumblings within the Congress. People who had become unhappy with the manner in which imperialism was functioning. There was a transition from the moderate position to a relatively radical position. People who initially felt that council entry was important for the Indian politicians, it was important for them to participate in the reformed council, they moved their ground as Gandhi also did. It is important, therefore, to look at this particular dimension of elite politics where several changes were taking place in the positions that the political leaders were taking, partly because of the kind of pressure that was generated from below. Pressures which came from the labor front, from peasants, from other classes of people, from the Khilafat agitation. It made a very significant contribution to the non-cooperation movement. It is the Mapla peasantry of Malabar, who had been rebelling against the imperial state for the last 70-60 years. During the non-cooperation, the Mapla unrest converged with the non-cooperation movement, partly because of a certain bridge between them and the Congress was built by the Khilafat issue. You are all aware that Khilafat had been able to arouse the artisans in the Punjab to political action. Price rise was certainly important, but at the same time, this ideological factor of Khilafat was an equally potent factor in actually exerting a certain influence on the artisans, predominantly Muslim artisans in the Punjab.
So what was the nature of the leadership of the Khilafat movement, and who among these people are eventually going to become important in the Congress?
This question becomes important with regard to the division that existed among the Khilafatists and the way a new kind of leadership was emerging in nationalism from within the Khilafat mobilization. But Khilafatists, as was the case in other kinds of political networks and groups, was divided into two groups. I am certain that you are familiar with the basic question. The threat that existed for the Turkish Sultan was the central issue. You are all familiar with the way the peace treaty with Turkey after the First World War tried to impose a harsh treaty on the Sultan. But after the war, protection of the Sultan had emerged as a central question. And it was around this question the Khilafat movement was galvanized. But the Khilafatists were not actually unanimous about the methods that they would employ in pursuing their objective. There were moderate Khilafatists, those who are very rich businessmen from Bombay. Their position was likely to be very different from the volatile artisanal community either in Delhi or the Punjab. There were small town intelligentsia, editors of small town newspapers, local ulama, teachers in Islamic scholarly institutions like Deoband or Firangi Mahal. These people were very different from the relatively moderate leadership among the Bombay Khilafatists, dominated as they were by the rich businessmen. If you look at the structure of local Khilafatist leadership, you come across a different nature of this leadership, which was more radically inclined. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who was to emerge as a very important figure in the National Congress later, or Ansari in Delhi, Hakam Ajmal Khan in Delhi. These leaders were relatively young men, and they were not happy with the more moderate line that the Bombay Khilafatists were actually pursuing. Earlier, the Ali brothers had been the main source of inspiration. Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali continued to be the main source of inspiration for many of them. Azad's case is very important. You are all familiar with the basic life story of Azad. He was in Calcutta. He was publishing the Al Hilal, the famous Urdu newspaper. He was maintaining contacts with the revolutionaries. Some of these men who clustered around Azad or who were friendly with Azad later on moved away from the mainstream nationalism and joined the Muslim League. But Azad, Ansari and others remained with the Congress to emerge as a very powerful group of nationalist Muslims, men like Maulana Azad or Ansari in Delhi. And these were the men who had begun their apprenticeship in politics during this phase in connection with the Khilafat agitation. But as you know, Khilafat didn't remain a distant issue for the nationalists. The Khilafatists remained a very significant factor to the non-cooperation movement. It was in fact during November 1919 in a meeting of the Central Khilafat Committee at Delhi, the non-cooperation program was adopted in its outline, which actually asked people to boycott institutions, to give up titles. So the idea of non-cooperation in a way emerged from the Khilafat movement itself.
So what exactly was the mediatory role that Gandhi was playing? And so how did Gandhi, who had spoken in favor of the reform of 1919, become a protagonist of the non-cooperation movement?
That's an important question. Gandhi had his friends among the business classes who were coming forward to support the Congress during this movement. They were giving financial support. Maybe their motivations were very different from the motivations that you come across among either the Khilafatists or the intelligentsia rallying behind the peasants. Gandhi was actually trying to build bridges between different segments of the population for different kind of motivations to come under one umbrella. So that is an important mediatory role that Gandhi was playing. And secondly, the latter part of the question is focused on Gandhi shifting his ground. You are perfectly right when you see that in December 1919, Gandhi was actually asking congressmen to participate in the elections and entered the council. Then why was it that Gandhi changed his ground so remarkably? So that by the middle of 1920, he was in perfect agreement with the Khilafatist position regarding non-cooperation. One of the major factors certainly was the treaty, the harsh treaty of Sèvres that the Allied powers inflicted on the Sultan. And that was an occasion for the Khilafatists to show an even greater degree of militancy. There was a need for organizing a massive agitation against the British Empire so that the empire is forced to rectify the Khilafat wrong. The other was the Punjab wrong. You know that you had this Punjab disturbances a year earlier, and the Hunter Commission that was appointed by the government to inquire into the disturbances in the Punjab came up with a report that virtually exonerated Michael O'Dwyer and General Dyer. Michael O'Dwyer was a racist, and Dyer was executing many of his racist ideas in practice. Both of them were exonerated by the government report, by the Hunter Commission report. It was in this context that Gandhi felt that there was a need to change his position.
So
There was a need to go for non-cooperation. Yes?
So what exactly did the non-cooperation program imply?
It's basically an extension of passive resistance, but in a more non-violent mold. I mean, how do you resist imperialism? And this was a problem that was raised by the extremists during the Surat split in 1907. I mean, the extremists, in order to work out a more militant strategy, suggested that passive resistance was the first step towards a more revolutionary active resistance. Non-cooperation is a sort of abstinence from any participation in imperial institutions. Students will not attend schools set up by the government. They would rather go to the national schools. People would not go to the courts for judicial arbitration. They would rather go to the national courts, the arbitration boards that the nationalists would set up to settle local disputes. People who have received titles from the government must discard these. People would give up their practice, give up their jobs, give up their association with imperialism. And if all the people of India became non-cooperationists in this manner, imperialism would cease to function. Because in the end, imperial governance depended on a whole range of collaborators, from policemen and army men to the bureaucrats. So if all these people had decided to discard the affiliations with imperial government, then imperialism was likely to collapse and Swaraj was to be achieved in 1 year. That was Gandhi's idea. Gandhi felt that non-cooperation, if pursued effectively, was to bring Swaraj in 1 year. Obviously, this didn't happen because not all the people who are involved in political life or important in political life would be inclined to accept this position. There were critics of Gandhi. It is not as if that all the people in the Congress were very naturally inclined to accept the non-cooperation idea, and Gandhi had a major task before him to sort out these differences in the Congress to establish the principle of non-cooperation as the principal watchword in Congress policy making. This Gandhi managed to do between the special Congress that was held in Calcutta in early September 1920 and December 1920, against the backdrop of a certain indignation among people about the Hunter Commission report. Take, for example, Motilal Nehru. Motilal Nehru was a great friend of C.R. Das. C.R. Das and Motilal were not averse to the idea of council entry. After the non-cooperation, they would form the Swarajya Party, claiming the right to enter the council. But Motilal Nehru felt that the Hunter Commission report was a total whitewash of the great misdeeds of O'Dwyer and Dyer, and he felt the need for an agitation against this kind of a sinister attitude of European or English officials. Some people who were followers of Tilak, however, were not so enamored by Gandhi's leadership. There was a resistance among them. C.R. Das was not actually in favor of non-cooperation idea. He was favoring council entry. But then by December, he was also moving towards that position, partly to take the wind out of Gandhi's sail, thanks to the connection that he had maintained always with the revolutionaries in Bengal, it was easier for C.R. Das to project as a more militant political personality, who, in order to emerge as a greater non-cooperator, also shifted his ground in the Nagpur session of the Congress towards the end of the year, in December, where a large number of delegates came from Bengal, perhaps to back up C.R. Das's claim for Congress leadership. But then, sensing the mood of the session, C.R. Das decided to back up the non-cooperation resolution. In fact, he was the man who moved the non-cooperation resolution at Nagpur. And it is through this kind of political alignments in the Congress, Gandhi was able to persuade the Congress.
So, how did Gandhi succeed in persuading the Congress to accept his program of non-cooperation? Also, in other words, I would like to ask, who were the one who gave Gandhi the necessary support?
You can see how there were sections in the Congress who were not in agreement with Gandhi. But they had to change their ground. C.R. Das is the prime example. There were many others. But I would imagine that the kind of support that Gandhi had already created among the business classes in Bombay, in Western India, where, as you know, a very powerful indigenous business class had already emerged in the later half of the 19th century, who were looking for a more protective cover from the national state, people who would be classified as national bourgeoisie, was a very important source of support. The popular support came from a large number of peasant delegates, delegates from the hitherto submerged regions like United Provinces or Bihar, people from relatively rural background, led by small-town lawyers or teachers like Rajendra Prasad or Kriplani. There are studies of these regions by historians which demonstrate that people from rural background, somewhat upwardly mobile, middle peasant or rich peasants, led by the small-town intelligentsia from regions like Bihar, United Provinces or Central Provinces, who came to Nagpur session and rallied behind Gandhi. So Gandhi had his own support among the ordinary people, people who were very keen to see Gandhi as the great leader of the masses. So it is through such support base that Gandhi was able to sort out the alignments within the Congress in order that the Congress would eventually come to his feet. By the time the Nagpur session was held, the entire Congress was simply lying prostrate before the Mahatma, their support to the non-cooperation ideal. The Congress began to wear an entirely different look after all these submerged regions became integrated into the mainstream national movement. The Congress floated the forerunner membership. An ordinary man could become a member of the Congress. Men from rural areas with paltry income were therefore enabled to become the member of the Congress. And in order to keep them together, the Congress created a hierarchy of organizations. You have the taluk level Congress organizations, units. You have the block level units. You have the village level units. And you have the provincial units. You have the district units. You have a hierarchy of organizations with different grades of leadership. You have local leaders, provincial leaders, and finally, at the head of this hierarchical structure came the working committee, 15-member working committee, which eventually would emerge as the Congress High Command. The High Command emerged precisely at this juncture when the Congress was trying to impose a certain amount of organizational control in the national movement in order to strengthen the power of nationalism. The organizational strength was absolutely essential. It was essential to bring different classes together in a unitarian movement, and that was precisely the Congress strategy. While they decided to federate different local grievances into a manageable movement. But historians have found from local studies of mobilization of the peasants that below this level, below the level of Congress leadership trying to exercise a measure of control over the movement and over the different constituent organizations spread across the country, you have evidences of a certain mobilization from below. People who were not part of the Congress, but who would be integrated into the Congress movement. This history of mobilization from below, something which has been described often by historians like Gyanendra Pandey, for example, as self-mobilization, actually points towards the existence of a pressure from below which flowed concurrently with what was going on in the upper layer of political life. This is the time when you come across unusual labor militants. Labor organizations were floated, unions were set up in different parts of India. All India Trade Union Congress was formed in 1920. The radical inclination in the trade union movement was to come a little later with the increasing Marxist penetration of the labor movement. S.A. Dange, for example, was a follower of Tilak, but over time, during the course of the 1920s, Dange was emerged as one of the main spirits of a radical, militant, Marxist labor mobilization in Bombay. You have similar such examples in other parts of India as well. But more importantly than the industrial working class, the support of the peasants was crucial, because what goes by the name of mass nationalism is basically peasant nationalism. The peasants constituted the large body of the people. Gyanendra Pandey, who considered that self-mobilization by the peasantry was a very important feature of peasant mobilization even before the Congress decided to draw them into the nationalist mainstream. In some regions, they became active in certain points of time. In certain other regions, peasant would become active in another point of time. So, such variations notwithstanding, the non-cooperation movement was preceded by tendencies of assertive militant peasant mobilization in different parts of India. You have the famous Bijolia movement in Rajasthan, in Mewar, ruled by the oppressive Maharana of Mewar. There were people who organized the Bijolia movement, established connections with the Congress leaders in the United Provinces, and these people eventually later on became the support for the state people's movement. If you move to Bihar, you have the movement organized by Vidyananda. Swami Vidyananda, the son of a relatively affluent peasant family. A very interesting work has been written by Stephen Henningham on peasant mobilization in Darbhanga, where Swami Vidyananda emerged as a peasant leader. And this movement was directed against the kind of illegal cesses that the Darbhanga Raj imposed on the peasantry. Vidyananda himself was inspired by Gandhi during the Champaran movement, but the kind of militancy or radicalism that Vidyananda was willing to endorse was never acceptable to the established provincial leadership of the Congress. Similar things also happened in United Provinces, where Baba Ramchandra, a person who had been to Fiji as an indentured laborer, then returned to the United Provinces, and United Provinces was a land of the great Talukdars of Awadh, who were propped up by the British as their closest collaborators after the mutiny. There was no attempt by the British to impose any restrictions on the Talukdars' power, no attempt to improve on the conditions of the peasant. This was the condition in which Baba Ramchandra emerged as the grassroots leader. So these examples actually draw us to the complex nature of leadership as well, alongside the complex nature of mobilization. People like Baba Ramchandra in Pratapgarh, in United Provinces, Vidyananda in Darbhanga, these were grassroots leaders. You have an intermediary leadership like Gauri Shankar Mishra in United Provinces, who would link up this movement with the Congress during the non-cooperation, and you have the higher echelons of the leadership, and all these three layers were not likely to speak in one voice. These divergences had been highlighted by historians who suggest that the non-cooperation, despite the fact that it gave a certain degree of militancy to peasant mobilization, also acted as a brake on their natural militant spirit. To that we turn in the next discussion, where we'll have a more detailed analysis of the regional variations and all these divergences that existed in the movement.